Welcome viewers on the discussion on climate change and technology. I'm Suchi Gopal, professor in the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University. My research covers a lot of different areas of geospatial technology, data, and mapping. I work in the areas of public health, sustainability, and many things related with marine ecology and ocean health at this point. And I would like to invite Amit Wadhwa to talk and have a discussion on the kinds of things that he's done since he graduated from BU in 1999. Amit.
Thank you, Suchi, and hi, everyone. So my name is Amit Wadhwa. I'm a program manager at the UN World Food Programme, and my work is primarily at the intersection of technology and food security. I've worked in the private sector before in software development, but I've also worked in the UN managing programs that monitor and measure food insecurity. My career path has been a bit, circuitous, I guess you could say. I studied bioanthropology when I was an undergrad at BU. I was really interested in diet and human evolution, but I was also taking computer science courses at that time. And after graduating, I headed west to pursue a career in technology. When I moved out to California, I worked at a startup company, and then I moved to a large management consulting firm. And when I was doing consulting work for the state of California, I saw some opportunities to really leverage tech for social impact. But I was increasingly feeling the call to do a bit of a shift and to work more in the areas of international humanitarian work and poverty reduction. And I also believe that my background and work in tech could be applicable in these very different contexts. I decided to pursue a master's degree. I did a master's in public health at Tulane University. And during my master's, I was really intrigued by food security and nutrition as areas of work that really tied together a lot of my different interests. And during my master's, I really learned a lot about statistics, applying statistics and geographic information systems to those domains. And it felt like a very natural place for me to focus. During that time, also, one of my professors, Nathan Morrow, who is also a Boston University alumni, he mentored me and connected me to a team in Rome with the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. I moved to Rome, and then I started learning more about the UN World Food Programme, and very specifically a unit called the Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping Unit. And that team really excited me and connected a lot of the dots. And I've been working, I joined them as a food security analyst back then, but also as somebody working on kind of advancing technology in our work at WFP. And I've now been in that team in various facets for more than 13 years now. So it's been quite a long time at WFP.
So, Amit, we are now going to be looking at one of the slides that we had made, which looks at climate apps, emerging technologies, and climate change modeling in terms of intersections and areas where they have sort of, produced some really useful apps for people. So when we look at the middle of the circle, we know that climate change is the greatest challenge that anybody in any part of the world is facing at this point. But obviously, looking at climate apps, a lot of people, including organizations such as the NGOs, the public, and everybody wants to use something in order to use real-time data and take care of their public health and food security needs. And you very nicely outlined the work that you've done in food security. Food security is one of the areas, but we at Boston University have also worked on managing threats, forecasting threats, making predictions for sea level rise, examining what exactly are the impacts if there is explosions of methane happening in urban areas. So I sort of figured we should talk a little bit about emerging technologies in this world. And I know that you've done a few things in terms of managing and conveying this type of information to the NGOs and organizations. Could you speak a little bit more about it?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the program I currently manage is called PRISM, and it's a project that began when I was in Indonesia. And at that time, there was a severe drought across the region. And a big topic of conversation with our government partners, as well as in the media, was the impact of this drought and what does it mean in terms of potential food prices, specifically looking at national rice prices. And this was a pretty hot topic because previously during large-scale droughts in Indonesia, it actually led to really poor rice production and eventually led to food price riots and civil unrest. So this is a very concerning topic in the context of Indonesia. However, most of the conversations that were happening at that point in time were really about national rice production, which is, definitely something of concern, and we understood that perspective. But WFP and our focus is really on vulnerable populations. So who are the people who are potentially going to become food insecure, who are already food insecure, who will become even further driven into poverty because of this drought? And so what we saw was an opportunity to really leverage this new sources of information to talk about drought and not just focusing on things like national production. And so using satellite imagery, there's big opportunities to look at national scale, but also getting down to subnational scale to see where are areas that are impacted by drought. And then from the WFP perspective, who are the people who are particularly vulnerable to that drought? And so our focus was really on smallholder farmers who are dependent on rain-fed agriculture. And to look at satellite imagery to see where are those people who are particularly exposed to that extreme drought. And this became more of then of a technology problem where technology could provide a solution, because one of the issues was that the government partners and the partners that we were working with and NGOs didn't have access to the satellite imagery. There's a lot of data processing involved, there's a lot of skills required. And so the opportunity we saw was that if we could use software to automate the processing of that information, put it into useful drought indicators, and then combine it with the information that we know about these vulnerable groups, there's a real opportunity to change the discourse. So as I mentioned, the project started in Indonesia and really in the use case of droughts, but we've since evolved it quite a bit to look at other climate hazards, including floods. And so what you're looking at right now is an example where we combine satellite imagery that looked at flood extent with what we know about people living below the poverty line in the case of Cambodia. This is a project that we did in partnership with NASA, a program called SEVERE, and it really was hugely beneficial for WFP and our partners in country to really understand how many people would require assistance due to these floods that occurred. This is back in October of 2020. And it really helped to come up with some specific numbers on the number of people requiring assistance and then the cost of that assistance. And that ultimately led to funding from USAID to really deploy and allocate funding that would really bring assistance to those people recovering from this very substantial flood in 2020. So we've talked a lot about food security and the application of remote sensing and satellite data to food security, but obviously there's a lot more that can be used in terms of remote sensing to mitigate and measure climate change. And I know that's quite a bit of a part of your work at BU. Could you tell us a bit about the projects at BU where you're using satellite imagery, remote sensing to assess and address risk mitigation and climate vulnerabilities?
Thank you, Amit. I would. I use satellite remote sensing for a variety of different projects in a variety of different applications. In one case, we've used satellite imagery. We're just beginning to use satellite imagery and GIS and spatial modeling to do with the offshore wind build out that the United States is currently engaged in. And this is happening as we speak. And so we are working with the Department of Interior on this particular project. I'm also funded by the National Science Foundation, looking at how do we protect coral reefs and how do we protect mangroves and build resiliency in coastal areas in places like Belize, Florida, the Virgin Islands, Indonesia, and so on. My work in Indonesia, which sort of nicely dovetails with what you said, is this is a country which has a lot of problems and challenges because of climate change. The land is sinking in Indonesia, which is a natural cause. It's plate tectonics shifting. And there is also the climate change impact with the sea level rise that many of the islands of Indonesia are experiencing. And so that's another project where we are using a lot of remote sensing and satellite imagery to do urban planning on the ground and help mitigate the worst consequences of climate change on the people in Indonesia. I also have a couple of other projects that's to do with AI and big data analytics, using a huge amount of information to classify, to segment, and to understand, what's in terms of policies that can be implemented on the ground. And the other project is methane, looking at fugitive emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that can be measured, that can be monitored, and that can be managed. So one of the projects that shows the impact of climate change as well as human intervention in terms of accelerating the climate change is the project on palm oil that I've just completed for the center in BU called the IMAP. I wanted to look at the deforestation trends in Southeast Asia, and the first map shows the forest core, and it's all the forest is both green and red. Green sort of looks at the core forest, and red shows, forest that's dispersed. They're called the corridors. They're called the edges of the forest. So if I take a look at this map in 2000 and compare it to the next map in 2010, you can see the forest in Borneo and places has already shrunk. And if I look at the next map in 2021, I see most of the forest, the core forests, have completely disappeared in Indonesia as well as in Malaysia. What does this add up to? I would like to now show you a map of the plantations that were identified using one of the satellites in one part of Indonesia. And you can see on this particular map that various palm oil plantations have been identified going all the way to the 1980s to 2017. If you were to look at a detailed map, and you would see the map also shows dots. These dots are the 1,400 oil refineries, palm oil refineries, and plantations that we identified. So we are measuring the impact of each one of these plantations on the deforestation as well as the biodiversity loss. I have another slide which shows the impact in terms of, the loss of, species, looking at endangered, critically endangered, and vulnerable species. You don't want any species to be critically endangered because they can become extinct in a matter of years. So we are looking at the loss of forest caused by palm oil plantations and other changes on land cover, and the impact on, biodiversity and species loss. So we all have a price to pay, and the species and the biodiversity that lives in those forests also has a price to pay, which could literally mean extinction. So Amit, moving forward, can we now discuss the general intersection between technology and climate applications? What do you think are the innovations? Where do you think we are going in the world of this intersection?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I could talk about it from the UN WFP perspective. There's been a lot of emphasis at the UN level on the role of digital tools and digital technologies for reaching the SDGs. I think that also relates quite a bit to your work, Suchi. And one of the initiatives that I'm quite interested in is it's called the Digital Public Goods Alliance. And it's really bringing together private sector, NGOs, UN agencies, and governments to collaborate on open source technologies, open data, to really achieve the SDGs. And I think that's a really interesting platform for collaboration, and a place where tools and data, which is open, is really getting more visibility. Because I think one of the key components here is really a focus on collaboration. And I'm quite interested in what's happening in private sector engagement on that front. And that kind of leads to another point, which I think is quite interesting in the general trends here, which is really utilizing forecast information. So specifically looking at weather forecasts and what can we say and predict about their potential impacts on vulnerable groups. So looking at not just climate trends, but specifically in short-term weather patterns, what does this mean for people who are particularly vulnerable, and how can humanitarian assistance be brought forward more quickly and actually preemptively, so that people who are potentially going to be exposed to something like a tropical storm or a flood event actually have some means to start coping before the event actually happens. And what's been really interesting there is that we have some very good collaboration happening with the private sector. Some of the big technology companies, with deep expertise in machine learning and AI, are bringing those skills to the specific problem. So looking at the weather forecasts and then being able to conduct predictive analytics on what this could mean on impacts for populations. So those are two of the areas that I'm pretty interested in that are, I think, trending topics on that intersection of climate and technology.
So I would like to add one piece there, which is how do we engage public in many of the developing countries? How do we give them tools at a much more local scale than just the NGOs? So we are looking at user interface and user types and UI models in order to understand what is the information that's easily accessible to them. How are they likely to use it? And who is going to use it, and what's the utility of providing them these kinds of tools? And is it a purpose of just communication, or do they do something with it? And I work with Belize using marine managed areas, showed us that, local people do want to know what's happening in their environment, what's happening with their coral reefs, because they're all so dependent on that particular, natural resource and asset. One of the things that's also interesting is to use local people and do some sort of crowdsourcing in order to understand how do they value natural assets? What's the kind of valuation they have? What is the perception they have towards different challenges that they face? Because this is one of the areas of research that really needs a lot more input from people on the ground. And I would be so excited to work with you, Amit, on some of those topics. I know you're working with NGOs, but this is a good area of collaboration between us.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that problem of how do you get information in a meaningful way to people who are most impacted is a super important one. People talk about human-centered design, and I think that's an area of work, that really needs a lot more emphasis, specifically on climate, right? Because the people who are most affected are those who are typically living in poverty and have limited resources. And so the ways that they access information are very different than the ways that we would access information. And so, yeah, these are really important topics, and I think very, very interesting for us to think about how we could collaborate on in the future.
Amit, what are the hopes for the future of your work?
Yeah, so I think actually similar to what we were just talking about with this human-centered design approach, my goal with the PRISM project and much of my work is to really provide access to a wide range of people on important topics, especially things like climate. And so that wide spectrum of users who need access to this information could mean policymakers who are sitting in the Capitol. It could be disaster responders who are actually in the field, or it could be farmers who really need to know, what is the weather going to be doing over these next few weeks? What does that mean for when I should be planting and when should I be harvesting? And so to me, the thing that I'm really hopeful for is that we can get a better understanding of what are the needs of these different types of people on climate, and how can we best serve that information to them so that they can be empowered to make decisions to reduce the risk that they're potentially exposed to. And so I think a big part of that really is dependent on, one, the human-centered design approach that we talked about, but two, also a really collaborative approach, because, on one hand, the UN agencies like WFP, we have a responsibility to protect and serve those who are most vulnerable, but, we're not experts in human-centered design. We're not experts in predictive analytics. And so bringing in those collaborative approaches, and to me, open source software is a really good model for that collaborative approach, is really, really important. And also, I'm quite excited to see how we could work with your students at BU to also advance that type of work. So to me, the underlying things really are, better understanding the people who need this information and working collaboratively so that we bring the best skill sets that we have from the various people who want to work on this hugely important topic, and coming together to find really good sustainable solutions. Suchi, on that note, I did also want to talk to you and understand from your perspective, I think there's some alumni listening to this work who are obviously interested in the topic of climate. How can they collaborate with you? How can they support your work? I think there's some interesting things that we've talked about collaboration between WFP and BU and your students, but I'm also interested in what you think about how alumni can support this work.
So I'm happy to answer that question. Boston University has a lot of different research centers, many different faculty working on these topics. As you know, these kinds of international projects require a lot of effort in order to actually execute it on the ground. So we have a couple of centers that I would like to mention. The first center is called the Global Development Policy Center, which is the GDP Center located at Boston University, that does a lot of work in many parts of the world. And we've been doing work with this particular center, running a project called Sex for Fish, where women are trading sex in order to, get fish to sell in the market and make a livelihood. And we are trying to understand how to stop this trade and what is it that we need to know in order to implement better policies on the ground. Another center is the Institute for Global Sustainability that has a very broad mandate looking at sustainable energy as well as sustainability and societies across the globe. So the third center is Impact Measurement and Allocation Program called the IMAP that is located at the business school that looks at sustainable finance and drawing in investments that can create sustainable societies. So BU has lots of opportunities in terms of people investing and making sure that an actual change is done on the ground. It's not just academic research. It's also about making sure that we work with partners on the ground and implement and bring about changes. And so at this point, we have a lot of those resources in place such that we can make changes. And so I'm excited to sort of offer those opportunities for the alumni network. So thank you for joining the discussion today, Amit. I learned a lot and I look forward to hearing back from all the alumni. If they have any questions, it would be wonderful to get feedback and for you to show an interest in the kind of work that BU is doing at this point. If you are interested, you could contact different centers, you could contact faculty, or you could contact me. But it was really wonderful meeting Amit and talking about research and how you're making changes on the ground and helping people deal with one of the most important issues of our time, which is climate change and food security. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the time, Suchi. It was great talking with you. And I'm really looking forward to collaborating with you and your students on this work too. Thanks.
Thanks.